Today, we're going to be discussing 3 perfect spots to bet large. And when I say large, I mean humongous. All of your money. You may be afraid to bet all of your money, but you have to realize you signed up for that because the name of the game is No Limit Texas Hold'em. A lot of people forget that we are playing no limit. They think that we are playing pot limit only. So many players, unless they're putting all of their money in for a little bit more than the size of the pot, bet the size of the pot or less every single time they decide to bet. But if you do that, you are leaving a ton of money on the table. And we're going to go through 3 major spots that I think most people make blunders by not using large, gigantic, all-in bet sizes. The first is before the flop. We're not going to be discussing all-in necessarily. Not quite yet. Slow down. We'll get there in just a second. We're going to be discussing playing from the small blind when someone raises before you. In general, when you are out of position, which is going to be the case when you're in the small blind, you want to discourage action. If you can just pick up the pot, that is fine and good, because from out of position, you are going to drastically under-realize your equity, because whenever you're out of position, anytime you check and you don't have anything, and your opponent bets, you usually just have to fold. Whereas if you're in position, and you have, let's say, a gut shot straight draw with an overcard, you can often call a bet and stick around, and then if your opponent checks, you can bet and steal the pot. So from out of position, you're going to find that you're going to under-realize your equity. Many players, what they do when they're facing a raise from any position is they re-raise to about 3 times the initial raise. So say you're playing 1-2 no limit and someone raises to $8 from the hijack seat. If it folds to you on the button, a lot of people make it $32. No, not 32, $24 From the small blind, they make it 24. From the big blind, they make it 24. And that is a mistake, because when you're in position, you don't really care if your opponent sticks around, because you're going to be the one who over-realizes your equity. So perhaps you should make it 20 or 22. But from out of position, you're going to want to make it bigger than 3 times the initial raise most of the time, unless your range is really, really strong. So when you are deeper than 50 big blinds, you can make it something like 4 times the initial raise. So if your opponent makes it $8, you make it $32 from out of position. That is going to make them fold a lot, but that is okay. If you have between 50 and 25 big blinds, you can make it something like 3.5 times the initial raise, so $28. And then if you have fewer than 25 big blinds, you can make it something like 3 times the raise, because then your opponent, if they do call, will already be shallow to the point that you can easily get your money in, and you've already cut off their implied odds with all of their drawing hands because they don't have that much money remaining in their stacks. So let's take a look at a few examples. I know this is a little bit small here, so I'll explain it. Here we have a scenario where the hijack raises, and then we are in the small blind. This chart here on the left, is that on the left for you? It's on the left for me. This chart is for when we're 80 big blinds deep. The one in the middle is when we have 40 big blinds, and the one on the right is when we have 25 big blinds. Let's take a look at this 80 big blind chart first. As you can see, you are re-raising all these hands in red, calling the hands in green, folding the hands in blue. But again, you want to make it something like 4 times the initial raise. So if you're playing 100, 200 in a tournament, if your opponent makes it 2 big blinds to 400, you're going to make it something like 1,600. That may feel like a lot, but that is what you want to do in these scenarios with all these hands in red. Because notice a lot of these hands in red, like King Jack suited, Ace 5 suited, Ace Queen offsuit even, these hands don't really care if your opponent folds. You may think, but how am I going to win any money? The thing is it's hard to win money from out of position, and you are going to under-realize your equity. That's really not what I wanted to focus on, though. I wanted to focus on these shallower stack scenarios. Now, take a look at this chart when you are 40 big blinds deep. So let's say we're playing 100, 200 in a tournament. We have 8,000 chips in the small blind and the cutoff raises. They raise to 400. In this scenario, we should actually go all in for 8,000 over a 400 chip raise with the hands in dark red. As you can see, pocket 10s, Ace King offsuit, Ace Queen offsuit, King Jack suited, King 10 suited, and Queen Jack suited. It may sound insane, but that is the most profitable option in a game theory optimal world. Now, of course, if you know what your opponent does incorrectly, maybe you do a different play. That said, you may actually want to go all in wider than this, because a lot of people will not call off against an all-in quite wide enough, which will result in you winning lots and lots of small bits of equity by ripping it all in their face. So those hands are shoving. Take a look at the hands that are re-raising now in light red, though. This is a very important point. As you get shallower, the hands you can re-raise shrink. Notice there are way fewer, call them bluffs in this scenario. Notice now King 10 suited is going all in, not re-raising small. Notice Jack 9 suited is 3-betting way less often. 10-9 suited almost never 3-bets. 8-7 suited never 3-bets, right? So now our re-raising range is going to become more polarized with just our absolute best hands that are fine getting it in, and then some bluffs. And bluffs are usually going to have an ace or a king in them. Not always, but usually. So we see like ace 10 offsuit and king queen offsuit 3-betting a lot, with the idea that if they get shoved on, they will fold because they're probably dominated. So that's the play. And again, at 40 big blinds deep, we're going to make it about 3.5 times the opponent's initial raise. So if they make it 200 at 100, 200, we'll make it something like 700. As we get even shallower, notice the all-in range widens to include more hands that have good equity but don't play especially well post-flop, like pocket sevens. If you call a pocket sevens before the flop, there's going to be overcards. If you're raised before the flop and your opponent calls, there's often going to be overcards. It's going to be tough to navigate, right? So instead, you just rip it all in. Also, a little bit more of the ace. We've got big ace X offsuit. Also, take a look at the hands that are 3-betting non-all-in now. Now, at this point, we have aces, kings, queens, ace king suited, king queen suited, and ace jack suited only for value, which is a much tighter range than before. Notice now we are missing a lot of the pocket jacks because they would have shoved pre-flop, and some of the ace jacks suited. So at this point, our 3-betting non-all-in range is super strong. Also notice we are missing a lot of the bluffs. Before we were 3-betting king queen offsuit every time. Now we're not 3-betting it very often at all. We're just calling it instead. So our 3-betting range, when we do make it 3 big blinds with a short stack, is super strong, plus just a few bluffs, almost entirely with ace X or king X. And whenever your range is very, very strong, you don't really mind if you give your opponent good odds, even from out of position, because you're going to be smashing them with your very strong range. Plus, the pot's already quite big to the point that we're just not folding if we get some sort of overpair, or maybe even over cards. So anyway, in this scenario, I just want to show that the strategy changes drastically as you get shallower and shallower with more all-ins, and your 3-betting range, non-all-in, gets much, much stronger as you get shallower. Okay? The second time you want to be betting huge before the flop is on Jack 10x flops as the pre-flop aggressor. You may say, why Jack 10x? Well, I'm going to explain. Typically, you're going to want to bet large and polarized on dynamic boards. So what is a polarized range? A polarized range is a range that contains your best hands and some draws. But it does not include your medium strength hands, like top pair bad kicker, or middle pair good kicker, or ace high. A dynamic board is a board that has a lot of draws available on it, but there's not a current hand available that is very likely to be the nuts now and by the river. So what this usually amounts to is that if there is a flush already on the board, say the flop comes Jack 6-3 all spades, that is a very static board, meaning if you have a flush, it's probably going to be good by the river. However, Jack 10-3 is a very dynamic board because there's no straight or flush available. The idea, that rule that if there's no straight available sometimes applies, sometimes it doesn't. If your opponent does not have any or very many of the straights in their range, then it doesn't apply so much. But if they do have a lot of them, then sometimes a straight board is considered to be static. Depends on your opponent's range. So anyway, dynamic board is a board where the current strong hands are somewhat likely to be devalued substantially by the river. So on these boards, you usually want to be betting large. Okay, fine. Next, when you have the nut advantage, when you have more hands that are incredibly strong in your range, and your opponent does not, you typically want to be betting big. And if you consider the Jack 10x board, an X, by the way, is any random low card, on Jack 10x, the preflop raiser has pocket jacks, pocket tens, Jack 10 suited, aces, kings, queens, ace jack, right? All these hands are very, very good. And the preflop caller is very often not going to have these because they would have conceivably re-raised these preflop. Like aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, ace jack, right? A lot of these hands get re-raised. So this is a spot where the initial raiser is going to have a very nice nut advantage. Also, you're going to want to be betting larger when short stacked. Either because you started short stacked or because there was a 3-bet before the flop or a 4-bet before the flop. And you especially want to be betting large with your strong but vulnerable hands. So Jack 10x is a very dynamic board and you have the nut advantage. So let's take a look at a few examples of this on this particularly interesting board. So here we have Jack 10x where we raise from the Lojack and the big blind calls. Worth noting, as you raise from the button, you should probably not be using these large overbets quite as often because your range contains more junk. And your opponent's range can be wider as well, which will also make it contain more junk. But in this scenario, we have a big nut advantage because our range is starting relatively strong. So we raise the Lojack and the big blind calls. We are 20 big blinds deep here, so kind of shallow stacked, okay? Flop comes Jack 10-5 on this side. Flop comes Jack 10-6 with a flush draw on this side. Let's first take a look over here. For all those who are colorblind, I apologize. I do not know how to fix this. Complain to PioSolver, maybe they can fix it. So here we have Jack 10-5. After the big blind checks, notice the hands that are in very dark red are going all in, which happens to be about 12% of our range. That is a lot. Ask yourself, how many times have you ripped it all in on the Jack 10-5 flop, 20 big blinds deep? For a lot of you, the answer is literally never in your life. And that's good because it means you're learning something. If you're learning something here, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button below. And you know what? While you're down there, be honest. Have you ever shoved it all in for 3.3 times the size of the pot on the flop? Ever in your life? Okay. Take a look at the hands that don't mind shoving. We have Ace-Jack offsuit on Jack 10-5. It's a hand that's almost always good, but very vulnerable, right? And then we need some draws to balance it out. Turns out King, Queen, and Ace, Queen make very good hands to bet all in with. We're also using a 60% pot bet in this scenario a large chunk of the time with a lot of hands that are, again, good but vulnerable, like aces, kings, king-jack, queen-jack, stuff like that. And then we have a lot of small betting in the scenario because we have a big range advantage. Range advantage is not what we're discussing today, but when you have a big range advantage, you typically bet very frequently. And in this spot, you're going to find that most of the 25% pot bets come from a lot of medium-ish strength hands. Like notice all of our 10s and our weaker jacks are usually betting small. Okay, over to Jack 10-6. So ask yourself, which board has more draws? Jack 10-5 no flush draw or Jack 10-6 with a flush draw? Well, obviously Jack 10-6 with a flush draw, right? This is referred to as a board that is more dynamic. So as the board gets more and more dynamic, you typically use larger sizes with a larger chunk of your range. So now instead of going all in with 12% of our hands, 3.3 times the size of the pot, now we're going all in with 26% of our range. 26% is a lot, but to make your life easy, it's with a similar selection of hands, just a little bit wider. Now we're going all in with all of our ace jacks, a lot of our king jacks, a little bit of queen jack suited, a little bit of pocket queens, and then some ace king, ace queen, and king queen. And that's it. Everything else is playing relatively similarly. Okay? So, nice, easy spot. As the board gets more dynamic, you rip it all in for more and more chips. If you were shallower stacked, either because you raised larger pre-flop or because you started shallower, you would be shoving with even more hands of a similar type, right? So this is a spot where you're going to be ripping it in. Let's take a look at another spot on Jack 10x. Here, the button raises, you 3-bet from the small blind, and the big blind calls. We are 50 big blinds deep. On the left, we have Jack 10-7, 2 spades. On the right, we have Jack 10-8, Jack 10-2, no flush draw. They look similar, but they're very different. So on Jack 10-7, you may say, there's a straight available. This is a static board. Well, not so much, for a few reasons. First, you have some 9/8s, and so does your opponent, but not very many at all. Neither of you do. So we're not so worried about it. So the next question becomes, who has more hands that are very likely good but vulnerable? And that's going to be you. So here, as you see in this spot, we have aces, kings, queens, ace-jack, king-jack, and queen-jack, and Jack 10, and Jack 8 suited, and Jack 9 suited, which are top pair and straight draw. We have a top pair and a straight draw, so pretty good hand to play aggressively. These are all hands that are ripping it in for 2.3 times the size of the pot. Again, you may ask yourself, how many times are you just jamming it all in a 3-bet pot when you started with 50 big blinds? For a lot of you, the answer will be never. That means you're learning something here today, assuming you actually do it. Obviously, the same selection of draws is going to be shoving. We have ace, king, ace, queen, king, queen. These are all hands that can shove it in. And interestingly enough, we're checking with a lot of the medium strength hands in this scenario because we really don't have a lot of them. And because our checking range is quite weak, take a look at what our checking range is, right? We have some ace kings, some ace queens, ace 9, which is not great, ace 8, not great, ace 7 bottom pair, random 7s bottom pairs, random 10s, and a lot of junk and under pairs. When your checking range is very weak, you have to make a point to check with your hands that are almost always good and not so vulnerable. So which hands are almost always good but not so vulnerable? Well, that's going to be straights and sets and two pairs, right? So we see here, pocket jacks checks every time from out of position in this 3-bet pot. Same thing with 10s, same thing with 7s, same thing with 9-8. Same thing with 10-7 suited and, half of the jack 10s. So make sure you protect your checking ranges in spots like this. As the board is more dynamic, you typically bet less often and more polarized, illustrated by this range. Jack 10-2 is less dynamic in this situation, especially since our range is quite good. And notice now we're just betting everything small because we have a range advantage and we're just nudging money into the pot on the Jack 10-2. So as the board is more dynamic, you're more polarized using bigger sizes. As the board is way less dynamic, you bet usually more often, assuming you have the range advantage, and you're betting using a smaller size. Interesting to note, though, there is a 60% pot size bet being used sometimes here. And if you take a look, I don't know if you can see it, it's a little bit faint. Kings, queens, ace-jack, king-queen are hands that like to bet big. Same story, right? So that's when you want to be betting big on the Jack 10-2 boards on the flop. Now, let's discuss on the river with a polarized range. Betting large allows you to profitably bluff with way more hands. And the maximum amount of bluffs you can have gets closer and closer to 50-50, a 1-to-1 ratio, as your bet size becomes infinite. Now, typically you don't bet 1,000 times the size of the pot. It doesn't happen all that often. So the way this works is assuming every value bet in your betting range wins when called, which may or may not happen, and when raised, which also probably doesn't happen when you're betting small, or ever in reality. This is the proportion of bluffs you can have in your range. If you bet 33% pot, the way this works is you want to structure your range such that you have the percentage of bluffs in your range equal to the odds your opponent's being laid. So here, your opponent has to put in 0.33, 33% pot, to win the pot size plus their 0.33 they're putting in plus your 0.33, which is essentially 1 divided by 5, which is 20%. You get 20%. 1 divided by 5 is 20%, which means you get to have 20% bluffs in your range, assuming your value bets are always good, which will not be the case, which means you need to have a few fewer bluffs than 20%, maybe 15%. If you're betting pot, now in this scenario, you're putting in 1 pot size bet, which means your opponent has to call 1 pot size bet to win your bet, their bet, and the pot. 1 divided by 3 is 33%. And as you bet bigger and bigger, you're going to find that you should, in game theory optimal world, be betting more and more polarized to the point that you're very often good when you're betting pot. So now you can have 33% bluffs, and in reality, maybe the actual number is something like 30%. As your opponent is more tricky and trappy, such that they'll check some hands that are always good, as very good players very often will, you should have fewer bluffs, maybe 30%. If you're going to overbet 2 times the size of the pot, now you're putting in 2. So your opponent has to call 2 pot size bets to win the 1 plus their 2 plus your 2. 2 divided by 5 is 40%. You get to have 40% bluffs. And when you're 2x potting it, you should be incredibly polarized. Now, when you are considering what being polarized looks like, it depends a lot on your opponent's tendencies and their range. Sometimes it's going to be like literally super nuts or nothing. Other times it's going to be top pair, medium kicker, and better, depending on the spot. Let's take a look at some examples. Here, what I've done is I have the same range, and I ran the scenario where on the left, this side, I did the biggest bet size I allowed was 120% pot. So we have 120% pot option, 60%, 25%, and check. Whenever you are solving any poker scenario, you have to tell the solver what bet sizes are available. If you are a good, smart, studious, diligent poker player, you let the solver run with a lot of bet sizes. A lot of people, companies, places, things out there solve spots using 1 or 2 bet sizes, and their solutions are not great for that reason. However, we've done a little bit better here. We gave 3 bet sizes on this side. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3 bet sizes on this side. Over here, though, exact same spot, but I allowed for an all-in bet, 4 times the size of the pot. So let's look at this spot. We were playing 40 big blinds deep, where the button raises, we call in the big blind, okay? Button raises, we call the big blind. The flop comes queen 10-5. We check, they bet 25% pot, we call. Turns a 6 of hearts. He goes check, check. River's a 2 of spades. It's on us. There's 8.9 big blinds in the pot. We have 36 big blinds behind. If you take a look at the percentages that each action is used, start on the right at check. You see we're checking both spots about half the time. We're betting tiny in both spots, 25% pot, about 3 or 4% of the time. We're betting medium, 60% pot, about 20-ish% of the time. And that essentially means we're using the big bet about 25% of the time. However, notice that if we allow for an all-in humongous bet, we're actually using the 4 times pot size bet in GTO world, assuming we are trying to play perfectly, 14% of the time, a huge amount. This is a spot where I would venture to say almost no one in the entire world uses this 4 times pot size bet. Myself included, probably everyone here included. If you actually knew to use the 4 times pot size bet in this spot, write in the comment section below, you're a genius. Then let's take a look at which hands are shoving it all in. Which hands are essentially the super nuts here, given the way the opponent should play up until this point. Well, it's going to be some queens. Turns out a lot of the queens, just top pair, on this run out are essentially the super nuts, which is kind of interesting to think about, right? All these hands in dark red are just ripping it in. That is the main hand that is ripping it in. Other hands that are ripping it in as bluffs are going to be hands that block the opponent's potential auto calls. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the opponent's range looks like here, but it looks like a lot of King X and Ace X are liking to shove it all in because those presumably block Ace 10 auto call and King 10 auto call. Now, will your opponent call the 4 times pot bet with those hands? I don't know. Maybe they're trying to block Ace, Queen, and King, Queen. I got to presume the opponent doesn't have very many of those, though, because they bet them on the turn. So that's what's being used as a bluff for 4 times the size of the pot, which is pretty cool. We also see some Jack X shoving, a little bit of 9X, a little bit of 8X. Pretty wild spot. But what I wanted to show here is that the pot's only 8.9 big blinds, and you have 36 back. A lot of people, 99.9% of poker players, maybe more than that, 99.99% of poker players have never made this all-in bluff. And they're leaving money on the table. Now, you may ask, how bad could it be to not have the overbet? Well, let me show you. In this scenario, with an all-in size, out of positions EV is 5.88 big blinds out of this 8.9 big blind pot. The solver will tell you this. If we use the all-in size, if we use the options that do not allow all-in, it's 5.81 big blinds out of the 8.9 big blind pot. Now you may ask, that's not very much, is it? It's only, what is it, 0.7? Is it 0.7? 0.07 big blinds out of the 8.9 big blind pot. That's actually a lot. By not making the shove, you are losing 7.1 big blinds per 100 hands by having no all-ins in this scenario. Now you may ask, what does 7.1 big blinds per 100 mean? If you're a good, strong, winning online player, you may be winning 4 or 5 big blinds per 100 hands. This is a huge amount. Every time you don't make this play, you are just leaving equity on the table and giving it to your opponents. Fortunately for you, your opponents aren't shoving here either, so it's reciprocal. But wouldn't it be nice if you were collecting that equity every time and your opponents were not? It is worth noting, the highest EV difference on one particular hand is with Queen 2. Queen 2 is actually 2 pair, right? You would love to shove 2 pair because it's basically always good. And in this scenario, it's actually a 63 big blind per 100 difference, which is massive, absolutely massive. Let me show you a few more spots where you're going to want to be jamming it on the river. Here we have a scenario where Lojack raises, we call the big blind, 40 big blinds deep. Flop comes Jack 10-3 with a flush draw. We check, they bet 25%. Notice they should have some overbets here. We call. Turn is a 7, it goes check, check. And here we're going to look at 2 spots. On the left-hand side, we have if the river is a 2. On the right-hand side, we have if the river is a jack, okay? So on a river 2, we have a lot of hands that are almost always good. Which hands are almost always good on jack, 10, 3, 7, 2? Well, that's going to be 9, 8, obviously. It's going to be, do we have any other 2 pairs here? We have jack, 7, often using a big bet, right? And then we're going to actually be betting big with some other jacks. We have jack 2 for 2 pair, right? We have king jack, queen jack. These are just essentially the nuts when it does go check, check on the turn. And we are using, again, a 4x pot all in. 4x pot. Also notice 120% pot bets being used quite often too. For bluffs, what are we using as bluffs? We're going to want to be blocking, presumably, a king or a queen, if I had to guess. I'm not even looking at it. I'm like looking over here. The answer is over here. Okay, at least on my end. So let's take a look. We are betting with queen 9. Queen 9 is a bluff. Queen 8, that is a bluff. Queen 9 and queen 8 look like the main bluffs here, right? We have a little bit of king queen. Makes sense. Story checks out. 3, 2, and pocket 2s are also jamming, by the way. What about if the river's the jack? Well, now obviously Jack X is going to be the super nuts. So we do see lots of Jack X making huge bets. We actually get to have even more over bets here. Actually, that's about the same. We get to have more bigger bets in general. Is that even true? We get to use 60% a little bit more. Anyway, what I want to show you is with Jack X, we're ripping it all in. 4x pot, plus some bluffs. Remember, Jack, 10, 3, 7. Looks like we just really want to have a queen or a 9 or an 8. The 9 and the 8 especially block straights. Queen, I suppose, blocks queen, jack. If that's that relevant. Maybe just the 9 and the 8 are super relevant. Anyway, as you see, similar selection where the queen 9 and queen 8 are ripping it in almost every time in both these scenarios. And this is a spot where a lot of people literally never shove. In spots where you have a lot of nuts, and your opponent presumably doesn't because they would have bet those on the turn, that's the spot where you want to be blasting your opponent. When your range has a lot of nuts and your opponent's does not, that is when you get to really, really, really get after it. So that's it for today. I know we looked at these scenarios mostly from a GTO point of view. If your opponent makes some sort of obvious blunder where you can exploit them, use whatever bet size gets that done. You'll find that some people, when they go check on the turn, they never have top pair or better, which is a horrible leak. Against those players, if you know they're always going to fold to a river 1.5x pot bet, 1.5x pot it every time when you can't win. Because they're going to fold if they have middle pair or worse. They're going to have middle pair or worse every time that they didn't improve the 2 pair of trips. Or straight, I suppose, or flush, I suppose. You get what I'm saying, right? If your opponents are blatantly terrible, life is easy. If your opponents are always going to call an overbet because they think you must be trying to bluff them, then value bet with an overbet, right? Poker's not hard if you know what your opponents are doing wrong. But I really wanted to show you 3 very clear spots today where you want to be using bigger bets than you probably are. And hopefully you can implement these strategies into your game. And that's going to go a long way to adding lots and lots of extra equity to the bottom line, which will eventually translate to money. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Also click the notification bell. We do a lot of work to make these videos for you. I hope you enjoy them. Good luck in your games, have fun, and I appreciate each and every one of you being here.